Have you ever felt that your avoidant partner hurt you deeply, but instead of apologizing or making things right, they just pulled away even further? You could see it in their eyes, that brief flicker of guilt, the hesitation in their tone, the silence that suddenly filled the space between you. Yet their actions told a completely different story. Instead of reaching out, they shut down. Instead of talking it through, they disappeared. This is one of the most confusing parts of being emotionally connected to an avoidant. You can sense that they know they've hurt you, but they'll do everything possible to avoid facing it. That's because when avoidants feel guilt, they don't process it like most people do. Where a securely attached person might apologize, explain or comfort, an avoidance instinct is to retreat. They fear the emotional confrontation that guilt brings because deep down, it makes them feel exposed and powerless. For them, guilt is not just about the act that caused pain, it's a mirror that reflects their own emotional shortcomings, and that's something they can't easily face. So instead of taking responsibility, they escape it through silence, distance, or distraction. They might convince themselves that it's better not to talk right now, but what they're really doing is protecting their fragile sense of control. If you've been through this, you know the feeling, that constant wondering if they even care, that emotional limbo where you're stuck between missing them and trying to make sense of their behavior. You might find yourself questioning, how can they hurt me and act like nothing happened? But here's the truth. When an avoidant feels guilty, they do care, they just don't know how to handle that caring in a healthy way. Their withdrawal is not always indifference, sometimes it's a defense mechanism to avoid shame, rejection, or vulnerability. In this video you'll learn the 5 clear signs that reveal when an avoidant is secretly feeling guilty for hurting you, even if they never say a single word. By understanding these patterns, you'll stop doubting your intuition, see the deeper emotional truth behind their silence, and finally understand what their guilt really looks like in action. The first sign is that they go completely silent. When guilt hits, avoidants don't apologize, they freeze, they retreat into themselves, shutting down all communication. Silence becomes their go-to mechanism to avoid facing the emotions they simply can't handle. They don't chase, they don't explain, and they definitely don't engage in meaningful conversation. Instead, they disappear, emotionally, and sometimes even physically, because that's how they maintain a sense of control. You might find yourself staring at your phone, confused, wondering how someone who seemed to care about you could suddenly vanish after hurting you. The truth is, their silence isn't random, it's a defense. Avoidants use silence the way others might use anger, or endless rationalizations, as a shield from guilt and vulnerability. When they know they've hurt you, their instinct isn't to make amends, it's to retreat until the discomfort becomes bearable. Inside their mind, staying quiet feels safer than admitting fault. Acknowledging that they hurt you would mean admitting your emotional importance, and that terrifies them. Avoidance prize independence and emotional distance, and guilt threatens both. It reminds them that their actions have real consequences, and that someone else holds emotional power in the situation. So they tell themselves, it's better not to talk right now. They think, if I stay silent, this will blow over. But that silence isn't peace, it's a subtle form of control, disguised as calm. Beneath that quiet exterior, an internal storm is brewing. They replay every detail, feel the sting of guilt, but instead of reaching out, they retreat further. They hope time will dissolve the tension, that you'll lower your expectations, or that things will return to normal without the emotional labor of addressing the hurt. The most challenging part is how their silence can make you question yourself. You might start wondering if you overreacted, if they even care, or if your feelings are too much. And that's exactly how their withdrawal keeps them in control, shifting the focus from their guilt to your confusion. Here's the key truth: silence does not equal peace, and distance does not equal indifference. Their quiet is guilt they cannot express. They feel remorse, but they cannot show it, because showing it means confronting everything they've spent a lifetime avoiding. If you're experiencing this, don't chase the silence, don't try to fill the void with explanations or desperate messages. Every attempt reinforces the pattern. Protect your emotional space, honor your boundaries, and let the silence speak for itself. Their inability to communicate their guilt is their problem, not yours. The second sign is that they start overcompensating in subtle ways. When an avoidant feels guilty for hurting you, they rarely say the words, "I'm sorry," not because they don't feel anything, but because expressing remorse directly makes them vulnerable. Instead, they attempt to make amends indirectly, in small, almost unnoticed gestures. This is their way of easing the discomfort of guilt without confronting it head-on. You might notice it in tiny, seemingly random acts. Perhaps they suddenly offer to do a favor for you that they normally wouldn't. Maybe they send a casual message like, "Hope you're okay," out of nowhere. They might laugh at your jokes more than usual, or show an unusual attentiveness to things they normally overlook. On the surface it can feel like warmth, a flicker of care returning, but it's never fully genuine ownership of what went wrong. This overcompensation isn't about truly understanding or correcting their mistake, it's about managing their own emotions. Avoidants are experts at self-preservation. The awkward gestures, the random attentiveness, the little favors, these are all ways to soothe their own internal discomfort. They want relief from guilt, not necessarily to repair your feelings. And that's why it can feel confusing. The actions seem caring, but they lack true accountability. A realistic example could be this: after an argument or hurtful comment, they might suddenly offer to cook a meal, bring you coffee, or send a thoughtful message that seems out of character. It may even feel slightly off-timed, like they're trying too hard, or being performative. They aren't saying "I was wrong, I hurt you." They're showing you gestures that hint at their awareness of guilt, without ever naming it. Another common pattern is sporadic attentiveness. They might suddenly compliment you, laugh at your stories, or ask questions about your day, even though this level of interest feels unusual for them. It's subtle, almost fleeting, and you can sense that it's not the usual pattern of their engagement. Their guilt drives them to try and balance the scales in ways that feel indirect. Here's the crucial part for you: these gestures are not apologies, and they do not always indicate true change. They are emotional breadcrumbs meant to ease their discomfort. The moment their guilt is quieted, they often revert to their default patterns: distance, detachment, or avoidance. So if you notice these subtle overcompensations, the best approach is to observe without over-investing. Appreciate their effort, but do not mistake it for full accountability or validation of your needs. Protect your emotional space and notice patterns rather than isolated gestures. Their overcompensation is their guilt speaking. Your clarity and self-respect remain your responsibility. The third sign is that they act irritated or cold. When an avoidant feels guilty for hurting you, they often don't admit it. Instead, they deflect the guilt by shifting the emotional focus away from themselves. You might notice them suddenly becoming distant, short with their words, or even subtly annoyed, as if you are the one who caused the tension. This emotional reversal isn't random. It's a protective mechanism designed to shield their ego from the uncomfortable weight of shame. Inside, they are thinking, "I hurt them, but if I act frustrated or irritated, I can avoid confronting my own guilt." By projecting emotions outward, they feel a temporary sense of control. It's easier to push their discomfort onto you than to face the reality that they caused pain. What can feel hurtful to you, their coldness, sharp replies, or sudden detachment, is actually their way of coping with internal conflict. For example, after an argument or after they've done something that clearly upset you, you might notice them rolling their eyes, giving one-word answers, or reacting with impatience when you express your feelings. They might subtly imply that you're overreacting, that your emotions are too intense, or that the situation isn't worth discussing. This is classic avoidant behavior. Instead of taking responsibility, they create an emotional wall. Another realistic scenario could be during a conversation about their actions or choices that hurt you. You explain how you feel, and instead of listening, they sigh, look away, or make a sarcastic comment. It's a form of emotional self-defense. By appearing irritated or cold, they temporarily shield themselves from the discomfort of facing their mistakes or admitting fault. This can leave you confused, questioning whether you've misunderstood the situation or if your feelings are invalid. It's important to understand that this behavior does not mean they don't care. On the contrary, their coldness often signals that they do feel something: guilt, shame, or regret, but they are incapable of expressing it in a healthy way. Their ego and fear of vulnerability override their ability to offer genuine accountability. So if you notice your avoidant partner acting cold or irritated after a situation where they should feel remorse, recognize it as a defense mechanism rather than indifference. Protect your emotional boundaries and avoid taking their projected frustration personally. Their discomfort is theirs to manage, your clarity and peace are yours to maintain. The key takeaway: when an avoidant acts irritated or cold, it's a sign they are struggling with guilt internally. Understanding this allows you to interpret their actions without letting it destabilize your own emotional well-being. Their behavior is a reflection of their fear and avoidance, not your worth or the validity of your feelings. The fourth sign is that they watch you from a distance. When an avoidant feels guilty for hurting you, they rarely confront their feelings directly. Instead of apologizing or addressing the situation, they create distance, but that doesn't mean they've stopped caring. Their actions become indirect. They observe, monitor, and check in subtly without putting themselves in a position of vulnerability. You might notice them still viewing your social media stories, liking posts occasionally, or asking mutual friends about how you're doing. They might pop up online at unexpected times or comment casually, almost as if testing the waters. This behavior can feel confusing because it's neither fully engaged nor completely detached. They aren't ready to face the emotional intensity of a direct conversation, but they want to make sure you're okay. For example, imagine you had a disagreement, and afterward they didn't reach out. Days later you notice they've been interacting with your posts, perhaps watching a live video or reacting to your updates. They're keeping tabs, quietly making sure you're safe and okay, but they can't risk a direct confrontation that would force them to acknowledge their guilt. Their care is present, but it's always wrapped in distance. Another realistic scenario could involve mutual friends. You might hear through someone else that they asked about you or your mood. This indirect check-in is their way of maintaining a connection without opening themselves up to emotional exposure. They want reassurance that you're okay, and perhaps they hope you'll forgive or move on without them having to explicitly apologize. This silent observation is also a way for them to manage their own guilt. By keeping you in sight from a distance, they can tell themselves they care while avoiding the discomfort of vulnerability. They can acknowledge the wrong internally without verbalizing it. It's a coping mechanism, a middle ground between emotional avoidance and genuine remorse. If you notice this pattern in your avoidant partner, it's crucial not to misread it as indifference or lack of feelings. Their distance is protective, both for them and their fragile sense of emotional control. However, this behavior also signals that they haven't taken responsibility fully. They're watching, yes, but they are not actively making amends or addressing the hurt they caused. Here's the key takeaway: when an avoidant observes you from afar, it's their silent expression of guilt. It's their way of saying, I know I hurt you, I care, but I can't face it directly. For you, the healthiest approach is to recognize their behavior for what it is, a sign of internal conflict, and protect your emotional energy. Appreciate the subtle acknowledgement if it exists, but don't wait for it to replace clear communication or accountability. Their distance is their shield, and your peace comes from understanding it without being pulled into it. Finally, when the guilt becomes too heavy to carry, the avoidant slowly circles back. But here's the catch: they rarely come back to apologize directly. Their approach is soft, tentative, and indirect. It's not a confrontation or a full acknowledgement of the hurt they caused. It's a careful test of the waters, a way to feel close again without exposing themselves to vulnerability or shame. You might notice it in small, seemingly casual gestures. Perhaps they send a nostalgic text, like "remember that time we," or react to a social media post with a subtle heart or comment. They might even say something as simple as, "I was just thinking about you." These actions are calculated. They are their way of reconnecting while avoiding the emotional risk of owning their mistakes. It's guilt mixed with longing and fear of being rejected if they reveal the depth of their shame. A realistic scenario could be this: after a period of silence or cold behavior, you suddenly receive a message from them, reminiscing about a shared memory or joking about something only the two of you would understand. It feels familiar, almost comforting, and it tempts you to respond. What you might not realize is that their primary motivation isn't reconciliation in the traditional sense, it's managing their own internal guilt. They want reassurance that you still care, that you haven't closed the door without having to face the full weight of responsibility. Another example could be their online presence. You notice them liking older posts, watching stories repeatedly, or sending subtle reactions that seem innocuous. This is a careful dance. They are gauging your emotional temperature. If you respond warmly, it validates them. If you don't, they retreat again. It's a cycle of soft engagement and strategic withdrawal, all stemming from guilt they cannot fully express. It's important to recognize that while these gestures may feel tender or considerate, they do not equate to genuine accountability. Avoidants are experts at managing appearances and emotional optics. The soft approach is their way of testing your willingness to reconnect while keeping their ego intact. They hope that if you initiate the connection emotionally, they can avoid facing their own shame directly. For you, the key is to stay aware of patterns. Appreciate the subtle efforts if you want, but don't mistake them for true acknowledgement or long-term change. Protect your emotional boundaries and ensure that any reconnection comes on your terms. Their guilt-driven soft approach is not a reflection of your worth, it's a reflection of their internal struggle with vulnerability and responsibility. Ultimately, understanding this behavior allows you to navigate avoidant patterns with clarity. You can respond with awareness, protect your emotional well-being, and choose how to engage, or not, with someone who approaches you tentatively after causing hurt. Their soft approach is a hint of remorse, but it is up to you to decide whether it meets your needs for respect, accountability, and genuine connection. If you've noticed these behaviors in your avoidant partner, it's not your imagination. Guilt does impact them, but in ways that are often hidden, indirect, and confusing. They may retreat, act distant, overcompensate, or approach softly, but the common thread is that their actions are motivated by guilt they cannot fully express. Understanding this pattern helps you make sense of their behavior, but it doesn't mean you need to tolerate it or take responsibility for it. Here's the truth: guilt without accountability changes nothing. When an avoidant feels remorse but never communicates it clearly or makes meaningful amends, their internal struggle does not heal the relationship. Their silence, emotional walls, or indirect gestures are their coping mechanisms, not signs of growth or genuine acknowledgement. You cannot fix it for them, and trying to decode every action or emotion will only drain your energy and blur your boundaries. Your healing begins when you stop chasing closure from them and start giving yourself the compassion, validation, and understanding that they couldn't provide. Recognize that you are not responsible for their avoidance, and your self-worth does not depend on their acknowledgement or attention. Every time you try to carry their emotional burden, you risk losing sight of your own needs and well-being. Remember, their guilt may make them retreat, behave awkwardly, or even return with small gestures, but those actions are about them, not you. Your freedom comes from reclaiming your power, protecting your boundaries, and honoring your emotions. Self-respect is not earned through their behavior, it is nurtured by how you treat yourself and the standards you uphold. So focus on yourself, value your emotional health, insist on clarity and respect in your relationships, and let their hidden guilt stay theirs to manage. When you prioritize yourself, you create space for real connection, one where accountability, care, and respect are mutual. Your self-respect is the ultimate key to freedom, and it cannot be given by anyone else, not even an avoidant partner.